The cargo manifest described them as defective biological units requiring relocation to Facility 17 for processing, which Captain Diana Vasquez immediately translated from bureaucratic nonsense into something alive that someone wants to pretend isn't. In her 15 years hauling freight across the galaxy, she'd learned that whenever officials started using words like processing and units, actual living creatures were about to have a very bad day. "Define defective," Diana said into her communicator while reviewing the pickup coordinates. Her ship, the Wandering Veterinarian, hung in space near the Kythrak military station like a particularly unimpressive metal tick beside a crystalline mountain. The Kythrak built everything out of their natural armor secretions, which made their stations look like someone had convinced a glacier to take up architecture as a hobby. "The specimens exhibit non-conforming behavioral patterns," replied Administrator Jektal, with the kind of clinical detachment that suggested he'd never met a living thing he couldn't reduce to paperwork. "Emotional instability, cooperation tendencies, and insufficient aggression responses during standard combat evaluations." Diana paused in her pre-transport checks. Kythrak were 8-foot-tall crystalline predators whose idea of a lullaby involved actual weapons training. Their young typically started combat exercises before they could walk properly. "How old are these specimens?" "Ages range from 4 to 7 standard years." "And you're calling 4-year-olds defective for not being violent enough?" "Correct. The subjects have failed all standard warrior caste evaluations. Facility 17 specializes in corrective conditioning for salvageable units." Diana stared at her communication panel. She'd transported a lot of strange cargo over the years. Sentient plants that critiqued her piloting, self-assembling furniture that kept trying to redecorate her cargo hold, and once a shipment of empathic crystals that spent 3 days making passive-aggressive comments about her life choices. But this was the first time she'd been asked to deliver children to what sounded suspiciously like a military torture facility. "What happens to the ones that aren't salvageable?" "Standard disposal protocols apply." Diana felt something cold settle in her stomach. In her previous career as an animal behaviorist on Earth, she'd dealt with plenty of creatures that others had labeled problem animals. The solution was never disposal protocols. "I'll be there in 2 hours," she said, making a decision that her bank account was going to hate, but her conscience could live with. The docking bay of Kythrak Station 12 looked like someone had hollowed out a geode and decided to use it as a parking garage. Everything was angles and crystal formations, designed with the aesthetic sensibilities of a species that considered sharp edges a comfort feature. Diana sealed her environmental suit and tried not to think about what would happen if she accidentally cut herself on the architecture. The defective biological units were waiting in what the Kythrak optimistically called a holding area, and what Diana recognized as a cage barely large enough for the 6 young Kythrak huddled inside. They were smaller versions of the adults, crystalline armor plating that hadn't fully hardened yet, giving them an almost translucent quality that made them look fragile, despite belonging to one of the galaxy's most dangerous predator species. The moment Diana approached, all 6 cubs scrambled to the back of the enclosure in perfect unison. Classic fear response from traumatized animals. "Easy there," Diana said automatically, using the same tone she'd perfected on terrified Earth animals. "Nobody's going to hurt you." The cubs stared at her with multifaceted eyes that held far too much awareness for children their age. The largest one, probably 7 years old, positioned himself protectively in front of the others with movements that spoke of hard-learned survival instincts. "Transport entity," he said in carefully pronounced standard. "We will comply with relocation protocols. No resistance will be offered." Diana knelt down to their eye level, a move that made the watching Kythrak guards bristle with alarm. "What's your name, kid?" The young Kythrak looked confused. "Designation: Combat Failure Unit 7. "That's not a name," Diana said firmly. "That's an insult. What do you call yourself when nobody else is listening?" The cub glanced nervously at the guards, then whispered, "This unit, I was called Zethki before reassignment." Diana smiled. "Nice to meet you, Zethki. I'm Diana, and I'm going to take you somewhere safe." "Safe location, Facility 17?" asked one of the smaller cubs, a female who couldn't have been more than 4 years old. Diana looked at the hope in that tiny face and made another decision that was definitely going to complicate her life. No, sweetheart. Somewhere actually safe. That's when Administrator Jektal arrived with 2 armed guards, because apparently Diana's day needed more complications. Transport Captain Vasquez, he announced with bureaucratic authority. The specimens are prepared for loading. Standard containment protocols will be maintained during transport. Diana looked at the shock cages they were wheeling into the docking bay, metal boxes designed to keep dangerous cargo from moving around during transport. They looked exactly like the kind of thing you'd use to ship animals you didn't care about keeping alive. Those kids aren't going in cages, Diana said flatly. The units require containment during transport to prevent escape attempts or self-harm incidents. Diana looked back at 6 terrified children who had just heard adults casually discussing putting them in boxes like unwanted equipment. Zethki was trying to comfort the smallest cub, making soft chittering sounds that Diana's translator couldn't parse, but which were obviously meant to be soothing. They're coming with me to the passenger compartment, Diana announced. Standard humanitarian transport protocols. Administrator Jektal's crystalline features somehow managed to express bureaucratic confusion. These are not sentients requiring humanitarian consideration. They are defective military equipment being returned for reconditioning. They're children, Diana said with the kind of calm that came from years of dealing with people who shouldn't be trusted with houseplants, let alone kids. And they're scared. Basic animal psychology says you don't transport traumatized young in isolation cages. The administrator exchanged glances with his guards. Animal psychology? I'm a veterinarian, Diana explained. Well, was. Now I haul cargo, but the principle's the same. You want to transport living creatures safely, you treat them like living creatures, not equipment. She opened the holding pen and extended her hand toward Zethki. Come on, kids. Let's get you somewhere with actual life support. The young Kythrak hesitated, looking between Diana's outstretched hand and the guard's weapons. Then, with the kind of desperate courage that broke Diana's heart, he reached out and took her hand. The moment their skin made contact, something remarkable happened. Zethki's rigid posture relaxed slightly, and he made a soft sound that Diana's translator rendered as safety possibility hope. The other cubs immediately began moving toward Diana, clustering around her like she was the first adult they'd ever met who didn't want to hurt them. Remarkable, Administrator Jektal observed with clinical interest. The units are exhibiting unprecedented trust-bonding behavior with an alien entity. This could be valuable data for the reconditioning protocols. Diana felt her protective instincts kick into overdrive. These kids aren't going to any reconditioning facility. Transport Captain, you are contractually obligated. I'm contractually obligated to transport living cargo safely, Diana interrupted. Doesn't say anything about delivering them to places where they'll be tortured for having feelings. The guards raised their weapons, which in Diana's experience meant that reasonable conversation time was officially over. That's when 6 supposedly defective Kythrak cubs did something that changed everything. They formed a protective circle around Diana, their young voices raised in perfect harmony, making sounds that roughly translated to Pack Defense Protect Pack Alpha. And Administrator Jektal realized that Diana Vasquez had just accomplished something that Kythrak military psychologists had declared impossible. She had gained the absolute loyalty of creatures bred for warfare in approximately 30 seconds, using what she insisted on calling basic animal handling. The implications were going to keep Galactic strategists awake for months. The moment 6 Kythrak cubs declared Diana their Pack Alpha, Administrator Jektal's expression shifted from bureaucratic annoyance to something approaching religious terror. He immediately activated his emergency communicator with the kind of urgency usually reserved for imminent space station explosions. Command Authority, this is Administrator Jektal, he said in rapid Kythrak that Diana's translator struggled to keep up with. We have a Code 7 situation. The alien transport entity has somehow achieved combat unit loyalty bonding with defective specimens, requesting immediate tactical assessment. Diana blinked. Code 7? What's a Code 7? Psychological warfare, Zethiki explained helpfully while maintaining his protective stance in front of her. Advanced enemy tactic for converting loyal warriors to alien allegiance. Considered theoretically impossible. I gave you a hug, Diana said incredulously. That's not psychological warfare. That's basic emotional support. Emotional support, repeated Administrator Jektal slowly, as if the words were from an alien language he'd never encountered. Which, Diana reflected, they probably were. Define this tactical concept. Diana looked around at 6 heavily armed guards, 1 panicking administrator, and 6 children who were treating her like their last hope for survival, and realized that her simple freight run had somehow become a diplomatic incident. It's not tactical, she explained with the patience of someone who'd spent years teaching basic concepts to complex creatures. It's just being nice to scared kids. You know, showing them they're safe, that someone cares about them. The administrator was now frantically making notes on his datapad. Subject demonstrates ability to implement advanced psychological conditioning protocols through emotional support techniques. Recommend immediate quarantine and study. Quarantine? Diana's voice rose. For being nice to children? That's when High Commander Grixnall arrived with a full tactical squad, because apparently Diana's mourning needed more 8-foot-tall crystalline warriors with weapons designed to perforate multiple types of armor. Administrator, the High Commander announced with the kind of authority that could probably command planets to realign themselves. Explain how an unenhanced alien has achieved battlefield psychological dominance over our warrior caste juveniles. Diana looked at Zethki, who was still holding her hand and showing no signs of being psychologically dominated, beyond the basic relief of finding an adult who didn't want to hurt him. I haven't dominated anyone, Diana protested. I just treated them like they have feelings instead of like broken equipment. Impossible, High Commander Grixnall declared. Kythrak emotional responses are controlled through strict military conditioning from hatching. No alien species possesses sufficient psychological sophistication to override our behavioral programming. Maybe your behavioral programming is stupid, Diana suggested, which in retrospect probably wasn't the most diplomatic response to an armed alien military commander. The High Commander's crystalline armor plating began glowing with what Diana hoped was indignation, and not a prelude to violence. You dare suggest that millennia of Kythrak military science is stupid? Well, Diana said, looking at 6 terrified children who'd been labeled defective for having empathy. It's not exactly producing great results. That's when Zethki did something that made every adult Kythrak in the docking bay freeze in shock. He laughed. Not the controlled vocalization pattern allowed for young warriors, but actual spontaneous child laughter that echoed off the crystalline walls. The other cubs immediately joined in, creating a sound that Diana's translator couldn't parse, because apparently the Kythrak language didn't have words for children being happy. High Commander Grixnall stared at the laughing cubs like they had just spontaneously evolved into a different species. What are they doing? Laughing, Diana said. You know, expressing joy? It's what healthy kids do when they feel safe. Kythrak juveniles do not express joy, the High Commander said slowly. They express obedience, aggression, or failure. These are the only permitted emotional states. Diana looked at him with the kind of pity usually reserved for people who thought chocolate was a vegetable. That's the saddest thing I've ever heard. The cubs had now moved from laughter to something even more unprecedented. They were playing. Not the structured combat exercises that passed for Kythrak play, but actual child play, chasing each other around Diana's legs, making silly noises, and generally acting like the kids they'd never been allowed to be. Administrator Jektal was documenting everything with the frantic intensity of someone witnessing a fundamental violation of natural law. The subjects are exhibiting completely novel behavioral patterns. Their neural conditioning appears to have been entirely overridden. I didn't override anything, Diana said, watching the smallest cub, who couldn't have been more than 4, attempt to climb onto her shoulder. I just showed them it was okay to act like children instead of broken soldiers. This is advanced psychological warfare, High Commander Grixnall declared with growing alarm. No known species possesses this level of behavioral modification capability. That's when Diana's communicator started chiming with incoming priority signals, and she realized that word of her psychological warfare capabilities was spreading with the kind of speed that usually accompanied really bad news. "Captain Vasquez," came a formal voice over the comm. "This is Admiral Kythrak of the Galactic Defense Alliance. We're detecting unusual Kythrak military activity in your sector. Please report your status." Diana looked around the docking bay, where 6 cubs were now engaged in what appeared to be an impromptu game of tag, while a dozen adult Kythrak warriors watched in horrified fascination. "Define unusual," Diana said carefully. "Kythrak High Command has issued a galaxy-wide alert regarding a psychological warfare specialist, who has allegedly compromised their juvenile training protocols. They're mobilizing 3 battle fleets." Diana blinked. 3 battle fleets? For what? To either capture or eliminate the entity responsible for weaponizing their defective offspring. Diana looked down at Zethki, who had paused in his game to listen to the conversation with the kind of serious attention that reminded her he was still a child soldier, despite everything. "Pack Alpha Diana," he said quietly. "Clarification requested. Are the home fleets coming to hurt us?" Diana felt something fierce and protective flare in her chest. "Not while I'm here, kid." High Commander Grixnall stepped forward with his weapon raised. "Alien entity, you will surrender yourself for immediate transfer to Kythrak High Command for interrogation regarding your psychological warfare capabilities." "My what now?" Diana laughed, because the situation had officially crossed from serious to absurd. "I don't have psychological warfare capabilities. I have a veterinary degree and a talent for not being terrible to children." "You have achieved total psychological dominance over Kythrak warrior caste juveniles in less than 1 hour, the High Commander pointed out. "This represents a military capability beyond anything in known galactic arsenals." Diana stared at him. "I gave them hugs and told them they weren't broken. That's not military capability. That's basic human decency." "Basic human decency," Administrator Jektal repeated, making more frantic notes. "Recommend immediate classification as potential weapon of mass psychological destruction." That's when the cubs did something that escalated the situation beyond anyone's ability to control. They began teaching other Kythrak. The guards and technicians working in the docking bay had been watching the unprecedented display of juvenile emotional expression with growing fascination. When one of the technicians knelt down to get a closer look at the playing cubs, Zethki immediately approached him and began demonstrating the safety gestures he'd learned from Diana. Within minutes, adult Kythrak were experiencing their first exposure to concepts like comfort and reassurance and emotional support. And they were responding to it like beings who had been emotionally starving their entire lives. "Impossible," High Commander Grixnall whispered as he watched his own guards beginning to show signs of the same behavioral modifications. "How are they spreading the psychological conditioning?" "They're not spreading conditioning," Diana said with growing exasperation. "They're just showing other people that it's okay to have feelings. You know, basic emotional intelligence." "Emotional intelligence," the High Commander repeated like the words were made of antimatter. "This is the human military advantage. You weaponize emotions." Diana opened her mouth to explain that emotions weren't weapons, then closed it as she realized that 3 Kythrak battle fleets were now heading her way because she'd committed the apparently revolutionary act of being nice to children. "You know what?" she said finally. "I think I need a bigger ship." That's when her cargo bay doors opened to reveal Admiral Kythrak of the Galactic Defense Alliance with a full diplomatic escort. And Diana realized that her simple veterinary background had just made her the most wanted person in the galaxy, for the crime of teaching alien children how to be happy. Admiral Kythrak stepped into the crystalline docking bay with the kind of military bearing that could probably organize a supernova by sheer force of will, followed by what appeared to be representatives from half the major species in the galaxy. Diana recognized the floating jellyfish-like Etherians, the insectoid Hivari, and several others she couldn't immediately identify, but who all carried themselves with the gravity of beings accustomed to making decisions that affected entire star systems. "Captain Vasquez," the Admiral announced, "you are now at the center of what may be the most significant psychological warfare breakthrough in galactic history." Diana looked around at 6 Kythrak cubs who were still playing tag, several adult Kythrak guards who appeared to be experiencing their first emotions, and a growing crowd of alien diplomats who were treating her like she'd just invented fire. "All I did was hug some kids," she said weakly. "Yes," said Dr. Threnal, the Etherean xenopsychologist, floating closer with his tentacles practically vibrating with excitement. "You have somehow accomplished in 1 hour what our most advanced behavioral specialists have been attempting for decades: the successful modification of Kythrak emotional conditioning protocols." "I didn't modify anything," Diana protested. "I just treated them like normal children instead of broken military equipment." The Hivari representative, Cluster Queen Vexila, made the chittering sound that passed for laughter among her species. "Normal children, as if there exists a universal standard for juvenile behavior across species barriers." "Actually," Diana said, drawing on her years of animal behavioral study, "there kind of is. Most young mammals, and apparently young Kythrak, respond to the same basic social cues: safety, acceptance, play opportunities, and consistent positive interaction. It's not rocket science." The assembled diplomats began exchanging rapid conversations in multiple languages while taking what Diana was beginning to recognize as extremely detailed notes about everything she said. Admiral Korthmax held up a hand for silence. "Captain, are you saying that these techniques work on multiple species?" "Well, yeah," Diana said, because apparently honesty was going to get her in even more trouble. "Basic mammalian social psychology translates pretty well across species lines. Most intelligent creatures have similar emotional needs during development." Dr. Thrinal's tentacles were now glowing with bioluminescent patterns that Diana's translator couldn't parse, but which looked suspiciously like academic excitement. "Captain Vasquez, you may have just described a universal theory of psychological development that could revolutionize interspecies relations." "Or," High Commander Grixnell interrupted with growing alarm, "she has just revealed the extent of human psychological warfare capabilities. This universal theory could be used to compromise the military conditioning of every warrior species in the galaxy." That's when Diana's communicator exploded with incoming priority transmissions from what sounded like every government, military organization, and research institution in known space. "Captain Vasquez," came an urgent voice. "This is Chancellor Dex Omar of the Rigelian Consortium. We need immediate consultation on human psychological warfare defensive measures." "Captain," announced another voice, "this is Director Walsh of the Galactic Ethics Committee. We require emergency assessment of human emotional manipulation capabilities." "Captain Vasquez," called a third transmission, "this is the Andromedan Trade Federation. We're prepared to offer significant compensation for exclusive access to your psychological conditioning protocols." Diana stared at her communicator, then at the 6 cubs who were now teaching a group of adult Kythrak guards how to play what appeared to be a cooperative game involving finding hidden objects. "They want to buy my hugging techniques?" she asked incredulously. "They want to weaponize your emotional intelligence," Admiral Korthmax corrected grimly. "The implications for galactic security are staggering." "The implications for galactic understanding are revolutionary," Dr. Threnal countered. "This could usher in a new era of interspecies cooperation." "The implications for galactic economics," added Cluster Queen Vexila with mercenary precision, "could destabilize every existing trade relationship in known space." Diana looked around at the arguing aliens, then down at Zethki, who had stopped playing to listen to the adults with the weary expression of a child who had learned not to expect good things from grown-up conversations. "Pack Alpha Diana," he said quietly. "Will the arguing entities separate us again?" Diana felt that familiar surge of protective instinct. "Not if I have anything to say about it." That's when the situation escalated beyond anyone's ability to control. The Kythrak High Command's 3 battle fleets dropped out of hyperspace in perfect formation, their crystalline hulls catching starlight like geometric nightmares. Simultaneously, Admiral Korthmax's diplomatic escort revealed themselves to be a full Galactic Defense Alliance task force. Within minutes, the space around Kythrak Station 12 was filled with enough firepower to sterilize several planetary systems. "This is Supreme Commander Thexkal of the Kythrak Warfleet," came a voice that could probably intimidate black holes into changing direction. "We demand immediate surrender of the psychological warfare specialist and return of our compromised juveniles." "This is Admiral Korthmax of the Galactic Defense Alliance," came the response. "Human citizens are under our protection. Any hostile action will be met with appropriate response." Diana watched the standoff developing outside the station and realized that her simple act of kindness toward children was about to start an interstellar war. "Okay," she said loudly enough to get everyone's attention. "Everybody needs to calm down." The arguing stopped. Every alien in the docking bay turned to look at her. "You," Diana pointed at High Commander Grixnell. "Your kids are not defective. They're just normal children who need love and support instead of military conditioning." "You," she pointed at Dr. Thrinall. "I'm not a psychological warfare specialist. I'm someone who understands that being nice to kids isn't complicated." "And you," she pointed at her communicator, addressing the fleet commanders, "are about to start shooting at each other because I gave some traumatized children emotional support. Does anyone else see how completely insane this is?" The cubs, meanwhile, had noticed the tension among the adults and were beginning to exhibit stress behaviors, clustering together, making the soft, chittering sounds that meant fear, preparing to defend themselves despite being too young to have any real defensive capabilities. Diana immediately knelt down and opened her arms. "Come here, kids. The grown-ups are being idiots, but that's not your fault." The cubs immediately rushed to her, seeking the comfort and safety that apparently no adult of their own species had ever offered them. Their obvious trust and affection for Diana created a picture that every alien in the docking bay, and, thanks to the communication arrays, every government in the galaxy, could clearly understand. "Remarkable," Dr. Thrinall whispered. "The human's protective response is triggering reciprocal bonding behaviors that appear to override species-specific conditioning." "Dangerous," High Commander Grixnell countered, but Diana noticed that his voice carried less conviction than before. "Such emotional manipulation could—" "Could what?" Diana interrupted, standing up with 6 alien children clustered around her like she was their personal fortress against the universe. "Could make them feel safe? Could help them develop into healthy, functional adults instead of traumatized soldiers? Could give them a chance to be children instead of weapons?" She looked around at the assembled aliens, at the diplomatic crisis developing in the space outside, at the galaxy-wide panic her simple kindness had apparently triggered. "Here's what I don't understand," Diana said with the exasperation of someone who had officially run out of patience for cosmic stupidity. "You all act like treating children with kindness is some kind of advanced military strategy. Like showing empathy is a weapon. Like basic emotional support is a threat to galactic security. But it's not. It's just basic decency. And if your civilizations are so fragile that they can't handle the revolutionary concept of being nice to kids, then maybe the problem isn't with humans. Maybe the problem is with societies that are so afraid of emotions that they'd rather start wars than admit that love makes people stronger, not weaker." The docking bay fell silent. Outside, Diana could see the battle fleets holding position, waiting for orders that could determine the fate of interspecies relations for generations. And in that silence, Zethki looked up at her and said something that changed everything. "Pack Alpha Diana, could you teach other adults how to do the safety feelings like you showed us?" Diana stared down at him, then at the assembled diplomats who were watching this exchange with the intensity of beings witnessing history in the making. "Yeah, kid," she said softly. "I think I could." That's when Supreme Commander Thexical's voice came over the communication array with an announcement that surprised everyone, including himself. "Stand down, all vessels. We request formal negotiations regarding human emotional support protocols." And Diana realized that she had just accidentally become the galaxy's first interspecies emotional intelligence consultant, which was definitely not what she'd put on her business cards. 6 months later, Diana found herself standing in the most expensive conference room in the galaxy, surrounded by representatives from 47 species, trying to explain to the assembled leaders of galactic civilization why their 1,000-year-old approach to child-rearing was fundamentally broken. "The basic principle," she said, pointing to a holographic display, "is that young beings need emotional security to develop properly. Fear-based conditioning might produce obedient soldiers, but it also produces adults who can't form healthy relationships or think creatively." Supreme Commander Thexcal raised one crystalline appendage. but human-style emotional conditioning produces weakness. Our juveniles show decreased aggression and reduced combat effectiveness. They show increased cooperation and improved problem-solving abilities, Diana countered. Your own reports show Kythrak units trained with emotional support protocols have 40% higher mission success rates. Because they work together instead of just fighting everything, added Zethki from beside Diana's chair. The young Kythrak had become her primary assistant and translator. Dr. Thranol's tentacles glowed with amusement. The human child-rearing protocols have produced remarkable results across multiple species. The Etherian Youth Development Program has shown unprecedented improvements. The Hivari Collective has experienced 17% increased innovative thinking, added Cluster Queen Vexila. Though individual emotional needs remain challenging to implement. The real question, said Admiral Korthmax, is galactic scale implementation. Demand for human emotional intelligence consultants exceeds available personnel by 10,000 to 1. You're thinking about it wrong, Diana said. You don't need human consultants, you need to train your own people. Any species can learn to provide emotional support to their young. The Kythrak Military Academy has begun implementing modified protocols, Supreme Commander Thexikal announced reluctantly. Juveniles trained with feelings acknowledgement demonstrate superior tactical adaptation and unit cohesion. You mean kids who aren't scared of mistakes learn faster? Diana grinned. That is accurate, the Supreme Commander admitted. The economic implications are staggering, reported Director Walsh. Species implementing human emotional development protocols show increased productivity and innovation. The economic advantage is becoming significant. Which brings us to the primary concern, said Chancellor Dexomar. If emotional intelligence becomes a military advantage, species that fail to adapt will be left behind. We're facing a galaxy-wide social revolution based on treating children with kindness. Diana leaned back and looked around the conference room. 6 months ago, she'd been a freight captain. Now she was architect of a galactic social revolution because she'd hugged scared kids. You know what's funny? She said. Humans aren't even particularly good at this. We just figured out that kids who feel safe grow up more capable. Most human societies have used these revolutionary techniques for thousands of years. Then why did it take human intervention for the galaxy to recognize these principles? Asked Dr. Thranol. Diana watched Zethki help translate for young representatives from various species. Because most of your species develop technology faster than wisdom. You built starships before figuring out how to raise children without traumatizing them. The Galactic Council has voted to establish the Department of Interspecies Emotional Development, announced Counselor Prime Harrison. Captain Vasquez, you are hereby appointed as First Director of Galactic Child Welfare. Diana blinked. I'm sorry. What now? The most important job in the galaxy, Admiral Korthmax explained. Overseeing emotional development of every child in known space. Plus, Zethki added helpfully, you get to travel and hug more scared children until they feel better. Diana laughed. When a kid reduced the most important diplomatic position in galactic history to professional hugger, it put things in perspective. All right, but I'm keeping my ship. Actually, Admiral Korthmax smiled. We were hoping you'd keep it. The wandering veterinarian has become a symbol of hope to young beings across the galaxy. Director Vasquez, came a new voice. This is Captain Rodriguez. We have a priority call from Centauri system. Defective draconian hatchlings require immediate intervention. Diana sighed and reached for her equipment bag. Some things never change. Zethki, want to help me explain to dragon people why traumatizing kids is a bad idea? Yes, Pack Alpha Diana. Teaching grown-ups about feelings is my favorite job. As they headed for the docking bay, Diana reflected on the cosmic irony. She'd started as a veterinarian, become a freight captain, and somehow ended up as the galaxy's leading expert on not being terrible to children. And considering her first case had nearly started an interstellar war, she was probably going to need a bigger ship. Again.